Hello and welcome to the GoldenEye 007 Postmortem. First, I'd like to present my credentials. I started making games when I was 12 on the 8-bit BBC microcomputer. This was as a hobbyist, and I would write in to magazines with games, and they would print them for people to type in, which is fairly incredible today, but a good way to learn programming. After university, I was lucky enough to get a job at Rare first placed as a programmer on Killer Instinct. This was a very hectic, short, by my standards, project of 1 year. We had to bring an operating system and a new computer, essentially, was designed inside Rare by Chris Stamper and Pete Cox from the ground up. It was a thrilling project. After this, I was twiddling my thumbs in the stable block where the Killer Instinct team was working, wondering what I'd be doing next. But my most important credential is this video that I made when I was a child. Thank you. I'm very proud of that. And full credit where credit's due, that was a team effort with me and my two brothers. My youngest was actually the star. I never felt most comfortable in front of the camera. I was on piano. And my middle brother was pulling down the gel. So, it's an example of how you need to pull together several technical effects to achieve the desired result. Now, the beginning of GoldenEye is a bit of a strange story. As I understand it, Rare was approached by Nintendo and asked if they would be interested in making a game for the upcoming Bond film, which didn't have a title at that time, only a number. And I assume there was some miscommunication, or at least it was a grey area. At that time, there were essentially two large teams at Rare. One had finished Donkey Kong Country recently, about 18 people, and the other had finished Killer Instinct Coin-Op. That was about 10, maybe 11 people. There was a little bit of competitive spirit between these two teams, but Tim Stamper, who was one of the directors of the company, was very much on the Donkey Kong Country team, and that was his brainchild, that game. And he went down to Leavesden, where the film was going to be shot, for a press junket. They were promoting the new film. All the big stars were there. I didn't know anything about this at the time. Here's a scan from some of the subsequent publicity from that visit. And here is a picture, very rare, I have to say, photograph of Tim Stamper, who also is keen to keep out of the limelight. On the left here, with the art director of GoldenEye, Andrew Ackland Snow, GoldenEye the movie, this is. And it says, I don't know if you can see this, Tim Stamper, who will design the Super NES game. Here's a photograph inside Rare with the very large supercomputer called Challenger. In the end, it was 20 processors, and it was awesome in that it could do a great amount of rendering, but not so good in that I had to reboot it every every day, or sometimes even 3 times a day. So this is kind of a funny start. Tim Stamper decided not to make the film. Greg Mayles on Donkey Kong Country, who's, I guess you would say, lead designer on Donkey Kong Country, wasn't that impressed, so they decided to pass. I heard about this as a rumor, and I said to Tim Stamper, "This sounds cool. I'd like to make this game." And he said, "Okay." And that was pretty much my pitch. I don't really know, and I can't really explain why they had trust in me after simply being second programmer on Killer Instinct. But I'm delighted and honored that they did. At that time, I was beginning to be involved in the hiring, and I hired my first ever interviewee was Mark Edmonds. This was January 1995. And he's someone you don't hear too much about from the GoldenEye team. I don't know if you ever have noticed the weird thing that happens on one of the screens, which is a very tall person walking like this. You can just about make it out. That's the only presence of Mark Edmonds in the game. Most of the team members were in the game, myself included, were in the game as a face on one of the characters that would be randomly generated or that was scripted. But Mark preferred not to be. So in the course of putting together my talk, I asked all of the GoldenEye team if they had anything to say about the making of GoldenEye. I had great pleasure talking to each of them. Mark, the first question I asked him was, what was it like working at Rare? And he was a very quiet, humble guy, and he said this in the nicest possible way. He said it was work, lunch, work, supper, play games for a bit, work, sleep, repeat. And for Mark and myself, it was a 2-year, 8-month project, and about 1,000 days, and it was a long project. In the beginning, we were probably working 10 hours a day, but by the end, far in excess of that. There was no such thing as an N64. The name before was Ultra 64, and the name before that was Project Reality, but circa the beginning of this project, it was called the Ultra 64, and the closest thing to it was this Onyx, Silicon Graphics Onyx, which I think the list price was about $150,000. This is you can see it's a very large box. It wouldn't fit under every desk. And it emitted huge amounts of heat, 4 graphics cards, and it was not that reliable, frankly, like all the SGI machines. If you pay that much money for something, it's not going to be all that reliable. And this was Mark's computer, and he set about, at the beginning, working on the pipeline for the game, trying to get a character on screen, trying to make do with, we knew it wasn't going to be able to do very many polygons, and we wanted lots of characters on screen, so trying to make a character, 4-sided arms, guru shading. That was the first piece of graphics I ever saw on, grey shaded, no texture, no artist. One of the major themes I want to pull out from this, that I was thinking about a lot when I was putting this together, was to what extent does it make sense to talk about a game or making a game as an endeavor led by one person? I find this a very interesting question. I'm in love with movies, as well as games, obviously, but I love movies and I consider myself a film buff. And from the French critical theory around the time of Truffaut, etc., they had this idea of auteur theory, which is the idea that there was one author of the work, and that was Francois Truffaut or whatever. Now, we look to films perhaps too often. Films were looking to books, and this was the idea that an author wrote a book. And no-tour is my way of saying, well, maybe it's not like that at all. Maybe it's a totally collaborative process when it works well, and there's no one authority and there's no one author. So this is one of the things I want to pull out. Recently I found some paper from the GoldenEye project. I originally thought I had nothing, but I'm going to show you for the first time about 10 pages of very, very early documents that I put together, which are all the materials that I have. This is my jottings. The date on this can't be right. It says 94. It must be 95. February 95. And I was wondering to myself, two very important questions for this game. What's the appropriate level of humor? And what's the appropriate level of violence? This is a list of questions, mainly, which is a good start to any project, I suppose. Can we get footage? Can we use the actual music? Can we use a title sequence? Can we use the likenesses? Can we use material from other Bond films? Can we get photos of props, costumes, etc.? A bit of a list. So I was wondering all this, and actually in a communication, I made this clear to Nintendo, and they were good enough to send back an extremely detailed document explaining everything we could use, which was an astonishing amount. We were very lucky to have such a broad license. So these are my thoughts at the same time. In my mind was Virtua Cop and Doom on the Ultra 64, as it was called. No gun. I'd also been playing a lot of Time Crisis, and together with Mark, and I could see the value of having a gun in your hand, but there was no gun planned for the N64. At this time, we had no controller or no idea what the controller would be like at all. So there was no certainty, but there was a rumor that there was going to be an analog stick, and that was all I knew. So I was pondering, would the analog joypad be okay? Is it okay to shoot lots of people? I don't think I actually put that question to management or to Nintendo. If I had, they probably said no. It was very much in my mind that Bond wasn't, he does kill people, he does have a license to kill, but it's not a gore fest. It's not an incredibly violent game. It's not an incredibly violent universe. So, this is very much in my mind. Talking here about Street Fighter is less violent than Virtua Cop, which is less violent than Doom, which is less violent than Pulp Fiction. Is an adventure aspect a good idea? Is the camera route fixed? Model destruction is crucial. Character motions be fixed. Can we use the likeness of Pierce Brosnan? Maybe two-player cooperative would be a good idea. Legal, can we use the Walther PPK? And down the bottom, I'm starting to talk about the schedule. Is it one programmer, two artists, two other artists? I was very much thinking of a small number of programmers and a large number of artists. Controls, aim, shoot, dive, left, right, advanced, retreat. These are all ideas. And then Tim asked me to produce a formal document so that I could show the management at Rare what I was thinking. So I produced this. This is April 1995, a couple of months later. Slightly drawing back my scope, focusing more on Virtua Cop, which is obviously a simpler game to make. Large number of character types, more moves than Virtua Cop for each character. This was all comparing it to Virtua Cop. More intelligent characters. This is where it starts to diverge. So this is suggesting that we spend much more effort on the artificial intelligence. All characters will try to survive, but in addition, they might be trying to reach an alarm switch, rescue their comrade, obey an order, play dead, hide under a table, or reach an exit. Wouldn't it be awesome if a character tried to hide under a table in a first-person shooter? I've never seen that yet. Large range of objects, more users for each object, more interesting 3D backgrounds. Already I kind of had the thought of missions. It fits so well in with Bond, but not the idea of 5 per level or anything like that. Talking about more and less covert missions. Bond storming a train or escape from a building with unsilenced weapons against stiffer opposition. The violence will be low-key, I say down the bottom. So gratuitous behavior will not be encouraged. Control, you can't really say too much about this. This whole paragraph is, maybe it'll be like this, maybe it'll be like that. We didn't have hardware, we didn't know. Realism, I knew that it shouldn't be totally realistic. It had to feel a little bit realistic, but what I had in mind was a kind of film realism, which is a silly realism. On the surface, it looks real, but it's got bizarre rules, like cars explode the instant you tap against someone, or, all the enemies have awful aim, which is the famous in the Stormtroopers. So I had this kind of idea of filmic realism, film physics. Bullets leaving their mark on the walls around the level. I think that level of interactivity, pretty much all you have is the gun. And the more the gun can do and reach out to the environment and feed back to you that stuff is happening, the better. Multiplayer option, I was talking about a link up between 2 consoles. Thank goodness we didn't do that in the end. So this is a list of levels, which is kind of two-thirds how it came out. We had we put Dam not as the second level as the first level in the end. We had 7A twice, as I thought. That worked out. Arethebo, I wrote six levels here at the end, Arethebo. So I guess, I wanted there to be a goodly number of levels, but I didn't feel there was quite enough material in the film. So I was trying to pull out more and more from the film to, make a substantial game. And here I'm talking through the possibility of the missions on each level. I listed the weapons, and looking back, this is very naive, this list, because it's so ambitious. I've got a sniper's rifle with a sight in this list, and the game wasn't supposed to take nearly 3 years to make. But you can already see the degree of ambition within me and also within the team in this document. Various gadgets, Q. Wouldn't it have been great to have Moneypenny? It was not to be. Now, this is an interesting list. This is visual effects, which I felt it was fit to dedicate a page to in this short document. Muzzle flashes, ricochets, cartridge cases ejected from guns, wounds, sparks from cute equipment, flames, smoke, day and night, gas escaping, sea and lake effects, mirror and glass reflections. Again, really quite ambitious for what was supposed to be a short project. So, in terms of materials from the film, we had very little to begin with. We had an early shooting script, which was lovely to thumb through, and it gave us a lot of information about what they were planning in the film, but we didn't know what they were actually going to shoot. But before too long, we were informed of their shooting schedule, and we were invited to go along to collect photographic material. And this is our copy of the document they sent. You can see I put a question mark on Statue Park there, wondering if it was going to make it as a level and if it was worth a visit to the film set. But all of us were very privileged to be offered to go and see the film set and see it photographed, which perhaps the director, Martin Campbell, might have preferred to have a quieter set, but it was it was an enormous pleasure, and it was an enormous help to making the game so closely follow the film. So the next hire to the team was Carl Hilton. And Carl said to me, it was great to go down to the sets at Leavesden and take photos of all the different locations. He also was a Bond fan. Almost all the team, we were all Bond fans. Selection effect. It was a project that personally interested all of us. And at the end here, he said to me, 32 by 32 RGB, 64 by 64 int. The N64 did not have a large texture cache, and one of Carl's bugbears and one of his very tight constraints was the size of the textures he had to make. And most of the textures were 32 by 32. Many of them could be as large as 64 by 64. And now, nowadays, I've never actually seen, but I'm sure there's textures that are 12 megabytes, which is as large as the whole ROM on GoldenEye. Nowadays, the smallest iPod you get is 2 gigabytes, which is 100 more times larger than the entire GoldenEye ROM. So people had very strict constraints to work to. This is Carl as a scientist being shot for no reason. And you can see the texture in the background. There's really not that many pixels there. So Carl was good enough to send me some of his artwork that was from his desk, which is funny, how relaxed we were. This is his list of what levels were definite. This was at an early stage. He's written here again another texture size and another one at the top, 64 by 32. You can tell what was on his mind. This is his plan for Silo version 1 at the bottom here. That's the level with the tall towers and was one of the very first levels that was modelled. We actually showed that at Shishinkai on video-only form with a mock-up. It wasn't a playable game at all. It was a mock-up with handcrafted camera splines. And then all the audio was added in afterwards. So that's a more modern reverse-engineered image of the silo level. That's not contemporary, just to give you an idea. This is Carl planning out some of his textures. Now, as we got through the levels, we got a little bit more sophisticated. This is St. Petersburg version 3 on the right here. But really, as Carl put it, it's not the art of Prometheus. You couldn't put this together in a coffee table book. But this is pretty much all the paper that we used during the development of the game. Really what we were focusing on was the tools on the SGI machines that we had, looking at the screen there, resizing the window down to 320/240 to try and simulate what the Ultra 64 would be like. B. Jones was the next hire. She was an artist and was responsible for many things, but chiefly all the characters. I asked her, what was the work you did that you were most proud of? And this is a bit of a tease, but the answer was building the 4 James Bonds. Each one was different. Roger has a white tux. Sean had a double-breasted jacket, and Tim had an open tux. I was very pleased with the likenesses, but I guess you'll just have to believe me. Sorry about that. This is another piece of work that Bea did, which was for the promotion of the game. This was done actually once the game was finished, and she had a little bit more free time. First designer on the project was Duncan Botwood. He said to me that he was most proud of the multiplayer mode. Steve coded it in a month, which was the work of a magician, while I set up the spawning, weapon, and ammo points. This is Duncan talking. And cut the level backgrounds down to 1/4 of their poly count. Then made new backgrounds when we didn't have enough variety. Carl contributed some fantastically complex environments as well, which meant I had to go back and do better texturing on the ones I'd made. On a small team like this, there's so many jobs. It's impossible to explain what each person did comprehensively. So I can only give you a tiny indication in a 1-hour talk. Steve Ellis was the mentioned programmer who did the multiplayer and many other things. He said, one of the things that always strikes me as crazy in retrospect is that until sometime like March or April of 1997, so that's 2 years after we'd begun, there wasn't a multiplayer mode at all. It hadn't even been started. It really was put in at the last minute, something you wouldn't dream of doing these days. And it was done without the knowledge or permission of the management at Rare and Nintendo. Sorry. Management at Rare and Nintendo. The first thing they knew about it was when we showed it to them working. However, since the game was already late by that time, if we hadn't done it that way, it probably would never have happened. And I suppose there's quite a few features that we snuck in, and it was only possible because of the fact that the management trusted us. They believed it in the team, and they weren't coming in even every week. I'm sure there were 6-month stretches where no member of Rare or Nintendo management came in to the team offices, which is really quite extraordinary, and all credit to them that they felt able to take that much of a lean-back approach and place that much trust in a team. All the people on the team had never made a game before, except for myself and A.D. Smith. So a lot of trust there. Graham Norgate was one of 3 audio people on the project. Graham was involved for an extremely long stretch of the project and responsible for all the sound effects. One of the fascinating things about the sound is when you actually shoot in GoldenEye and you hit something like 7, 8, or 9, sound effects will actually trigger. So much effort was put into the various permutations and combinations and the randomness in the sound effects to try and give a punch and a pleasant tactile sensation, and the reward of yes, I the game know you're hitting this, I know you're hitting that, I know you're hitting the other. So an enormous amount of effort went into polishing, compressing, iterating on those sounds. And Graham did all of that, but he was also a composer, and he wrote half of the music. Something like 40 or 50 pieces of music in the entire game, which is an incredible feat, not least because of the measly budget I gave them to fit all of the sound effects, all of the instrument effects, and all of the MIDI music on the ROM. This is the famous David Doak. He was the second and last designer to join the team. This is him as a scientist. He was unusual. We had a great piece of good luck. He was actually a biochemist. His PhD was in biochemistry. Before I hired him to Rare to actually be a system administrator for Rare. But after a while, talking to him, we had a great relationship, and I felt that he had been an awesome addition to the team. And I'm so glad I made that choice. He was unquestionably one of the best FES designers in the world. This is Dave Doak and myself being silly. The team had to produce. We scratched for what photographic materials we could get, but there was very little in the way of faces of the actors. Even the bit parts, even Pierce Brosnan. So it was like magazines, and we found a picture of Jaws. It was about this big in some magazine. So yeah, that's great. We used Jaws. And here we are. We're dressing up to provide silhouettes for the video screens in 7A bunker. This is actually a later picture from near the end. What I've got in my hand there is the mock-up of the box art for the product that was produced by Nintendo. They sent it to us. We printed it out on one of the few color printers in the company, and I folded it together to make a simulation of what the box would look like. One of the things I'd like to talk about in GoldenEye that I think isn't spoken about enough is the humor. There's a lot of things that happen in there. Some were intentional, some were not so intentional. But I think all of them are a great addition to the game that help to make you laugh. Any first-person shooter and almost any game is a series of hills and valleys of tension. You go around a corner, maybe there's a guy there. Oh, there isn't. You go around another corner, no guy. Oh, I hear some shooting over there. Come around a corner, 3 guys, bang, bang, bang. So that's ramping up the tension. But to bring it down again is more difficult. And humor's incredibly important for that. And, that helps to bring the valleys in and to give the level a structure, an emotional structure, which is really important for people's reward, because people are, at base, emotional animals. So, it's not really realistic. It was kind of cool. Mark was very pleased the first time he got the watch to come up on the screen, but really it's a little bit silly. And the explosions is another example of humor, because for reasons I still don't understand, when there's an explosion, there's kind of a crediting effect, and the software credits the momentum to the nearby enemies, and when it reaches a certain amount, they fly off. So what happens is there's an explosion, people are there like this, slightly too long, and then they fly off into the air. And it is very, very funny. And, I personally, by rights, I should have been sick of the game by the end of, 2 2/3 years. But I derived a great deal of satisfaction from just, lobbing around a few mines, blowing up people, watching them cascade around. The silly... There's an argument that we could have had more quality control, and we could have said, yeah, you know what, let's not have the Moonraker outfits. They're a bit silly. But instead, B made it, and it went in. It is silly, but it's also great. The slapping. How did nobody ever said on the team? No one ever said this is ridiculous. It was one of a very, very long list of things. We wanted it, we implemented it. It seemed okay. We moved on. It's absolutely hilarious, and I love it. But again, you could make an argument that it should be different, more realistic, much more sober, and I think you'd be taking out a lot of character of the game. The toilets, the English and the Japanese found the humor of the toilets. So, overall, what I love to try and put into a game is a sense of humor. I think people want to have fun, and a part of that is laughter. But also, any game that presents a challenge, it can become tiresome. The frustration can become overbearing. The more humor you can get in there, the better. And a lot of it is going to be serendipity. It's going to be things you do that you didn't plan on, what they turn out to be a little bit silly. And if you can leave those, and the team's comfortable to leave them, that's great. Next thing I want to talk about is mistakes I like, things that by rights are really, truly a mistake in game design. I guess some of you might know, probably the biggest one is Oddjob. Really, I can hear someone sighing with anxiety and tension. Oddjob was an annoying character in multiplayer because it was very hard to shoot because he was so short. And you could certainly make an argument that he should never have been in the game. That it would be a better game without him. One of your friends is going to choose Oddjob. It's a cheaty thing to do, and it spoils the game. But to me, that's a social dynamics problem. You should be putting pressure on your friend to not be a cheater. But people have redefined this as, Oddjob is what the cheater picks. And I think that's a beautiful solution to what could be said was underbalancing. We didn't have time to balance all the characters. Really, we just threw them in for the multiplayer. But these little quirks and bits of sketchiness, I really strongly feel they bring personality to the game. Another one of the things that I personally feel so proud about the game is kind of sandbox nature. It's not really a sandbox game, but many of the levels are linear, and many of them you have a little bit of choice. You could do the missions in this order or that order, but really, you can't really say it's a sandbox game. But there's a sandboxy way to play it, and that's when you don't care about the missions anymore. When you played it enough, and you just want to mess around with the guys. And my personal favorite, I spent, I remember 6 hours one evening playing in the bunker, drawing in more of the infinite spawn enemies and shooting their hats off. 6 hours, and I had like a massive collection of hats on the ground, and you could shoot them. I don't know if you ever know this. You can shoot them. You can get them up in the air. You can juggle the hats. You can shoot them up. A couple of people are nodding. You can shoot them. That is a really pleasurable thing, and it's something that came out of the game development totally organically. Nobody ever said, let's make it so that you can shoot the hats in the air for 6 hours. It would have been a ridiculous statement, but what we did say was, hats are kind of funny. Why don't we have some hats? And the rest was Mark Edmonds' execution. Now, at one stage, we did have some much more violent effects in the game. We had one texture, a long animated texture, masses of blood. So when you shoot something, it was made me feel. I consider myself to have a strong stomach. Made me feel a little bit uncomfortable seeing this in glorious 3D. Howard Lincoln came round one time and he saw one of our animations, which was to shoot someone in the groin, and they then would writhe around on the ground for. It seemed like it must have been less than 2 minutes, but it seemed like forever that they were there writhing around on the ground. And it had a humour value, but really it was too violent. And we took out the flipbook texture, incredibly bloody. We toned down the hits so they're really quite subtle on the bodies. That they are red. The characters disappear after you have shot them. Totally not realistic, but it kind of underlines the fact that you shouldn't really care about them. That you shouldn't feel bad about shooting them. It makes it easier to play a game which is, like any FPS, it is essentially about killing a long series of people. And I have to say, the graphics, which today look so blocky and awkward, even in the day, they were a little. The shape of the head, it was a little bit, can't we do better than this? But that non-realism in the graphics was actually a big help to making it a more light game and more in touch with the Bond universe. So Grant Kirkhope was the other main composer on the project. He's also a guitarist, and he did the guitar riffs on some of the more electric rock versions of the GoldenEye Monty Norman piece. Grant said to me, "I wish I had added longer tunes to the game. I remember asking Mr. Hollis how long I should make the tunes, as I was completely new to games and I had no idea. I remember him saying that he thought a minute would be sufficient and quickly went back to his business and dismissed me. How was I to know that you could spend forever running around levels hearing the same tune over and over and over again? Thanks, Martin." Sorry, Grant. Robin Beanland was the third composer. The music guys were the only people who were out of the team building. The audio team was all together, and Rare was privileged to have these three guys who were incredibly talented musicians, composers from the professional world, rather than games design, rather than game development per se. Robin Wieland only wrote one piece of music, which was the elevator music, which you can hear in such levels as the complex and the caves. It's just a little joke, but I'm very attached to it. Adrian Smith was the third and last artist. He said to me, "I was particularly pleased with the effects that I produced for the game. The muzzle flashes, the tracer fire, and the explosions were very influenced with the film Heat. I was very pleased with the end sequence of the blood coming down the screen. I wish I had copyrighted the watch graphics as a mechanic for the status for health indicator." I mentioned Stephen Ellis. So here's a nice shot of the multiplayer. This is actually running on an emulator. If you blow up the N64 screen on a big screen like this, NTSC was the major limiting factor. It's really it's not got many pixels at all in the actual bandwidth for NTSC. But this was one of the things that I feel has held up least well about the game is the sharpness. I asked Adrian what he wished he'd put in to the game, and he said the firing range. This is something he actually modelled. It was an environment from Q Branch. It would have been great if it was added and incorporated with some mini games. Well, that was one of the very few things that we didn't get around to actually getting in, but it came true with Perfect Dark. So, by this point, we had the entire team assembled, and we're in the home stretch. I have to admit that I don't remember any talk of deadlines or schedules, which is completely astounding. I assume that as lead on the project, I was told what the deadline was, probably several times. But I was so focused on what could be done to make the game better that today this isn't in my mind at all. Now, this is actually a graph by Ben Cousins that he sent around on Twitter recently to try and educate people who don't know game development how quickly your game will actually develop. What you think will happen is you think linearly your game will get better. Halfway through, you'll think you'll have half a game. It's not the case at all. Halfway through, you basically don't have anything. You don't have a game. So halfway through GoldenEye, we did have a game, and I remember sitting in the office with Mark Edmonds, and he said, come on, have a go. And I had a go, and I just remember not really feeling anything, and I didn't say anything, and I just kind of... I guess my face said everything. It was absolutely diabolical. It was in the bunker, in the interior. The movement was completely dead. The sound effects were completely dead. The gun was dead on the screen. It had no reaction, no movement. There was no auto aim. There was a crosshair. You had to line up perfect. It was completely no juice at all in the game. And essentially, it took circa a year to add layer on layer on layer of little movements, little sounds, little reactive effects, graphical effects on textures when you shoot, little glints on the gun, layer upon layer upon layer of little effects just to try and make it feel more punchy and more like the game was actually listening to what you were doing. And in this final year, we were working so hard, I can't remember it at all. So I have almost nothing more to say about that. The home stretch, the game was finished. We were able to add little sprinkles, little additions, things that were just nice to have, like the cheats. Steve Ellis programmed these. We just had a quick discussion in the office. Oh, what? Yeah, that would be cool. Yeah, why don't we have big heads like Donkey Kong Country? That'll be funny. Tiny bombs. Yeah, that's amusing. And we added the other cheats, and I think we had 17. It was just the number we could think of that we thought were cool. A little bit of an intro and an outro on the game. This is a joke referencing the BBFC, the film review board in the UK, and this is my signature at the bottom left, and my attempt to write James Bond, how he would sign it there. Yeah, all this was added right at the end. At this point, we finally had a full complement of levels, 18 from the GoldenEye movie and 2 extra bonus from other films. A little story about the balancing on that. Dave Doak and I played the Aztec after he had set it up. And we both found it very hard on 00. But given a couple of hours, we could both do it. And then, being the mischievous pair that we were, I said to him, "Okay, that's good. Now, why don't you just make it a little bit harder?" So the Aztec is just slightly harder than we were able to do ourselves at the time, and it's, in my opinion, it's arguably the hardest level in the game on 00. But I still get a great deal of satisfaction from playing it, although it can be frustrating at times. So Mark had a little story he pointed out to me that I'd forgotten about, which was the craziest, coolest thing We'd finished the game. It had been through test. We'd marked off all the bugs. Everything was good. They sent it through lot check, which is a long process where they play the game to death for like 2 weeks and tested on all the combinations of televisions and so on. And then it came back, and there was a problem on one of the levels when you played it in a certain order. It was probably the frigate. Played in a certain order, there'd be a certain sequence of characters being instantiated, and they'd have terrible texture maps on them because there wasn't enough memory. It had a dynamic memory system, which is, it worked okay most of the time, but memory was very tight on this level. So what I had to do was write, in order to make a minimum change, and the version control system wasn't that reliable, in order to make a minimum change, that day, I wrote a tool to extract the code and the data for the code from the ROM. It was gzipped. So basically a custom un-gzip. I wrote that, adjusted the memory numbers, re-gzipped it, whopped it back into the ROM image without recompiling anything, and sent it to Nintendo. So that's the final version, and Mark says, thankfully it worked, and it still makes me smile. It's kind of, I don't know if it was the best way to do that or not to this day, but it was a minimum change, and it worked. Another little story from the final days, which was the crates used to say vodka on them, which is Russian for vodka. Unfortunately, pretty late on, Nintendo noticed they had a guy who spoke Russian and said, yeah. But by and large, almost all the things we wanted to get into the game we were able to fit them in with no resistance from Rare management or Nintendo or even Eon and Dan Jack, who are the production company that make the movies and the license controlling company. So, I'd like to say thank you to all of those people for allowing us to realize our vision. And then the game was finished, and I guess it was a tiny bit of an anticlimax, but there was a certain amount of pleasure, being able to look at things that nearly 3 years before had just been a few words, saying the dam would have 3 towers, and now, being able to enjoy our work. Mark Edmonds says, I remember Tim asking shortly after we had finished what I would rate the game. I think I said 7 out of 10. So there must have been a lot of areas I still thought could have been improved even back then. And I think that sums up how all of us felt about the game. We didn't really know whether it was awesome or whether it was okay or whether it would fall on deaf ears in the marketplace because the film had been a long time ago. And to our eyes, the graphics on the levels we'd made first were not as good as the graphics on the levels we'd made last. So there's a lot of questions in our minds. This is the closest thing I've got to a GoldenEye team photo. This is not the GoldenEye team. This is part of the Perfect Dark team. From left to right, we've got Steve Ellis, Graham Norgate, Mark Edmonds. That's Ross Burry, who was Perfect Dark only. Carl Hilton, David Doak, myself, B. Jones, and Lee Ray, who was also Perfect Dark only. So, autor or notor? My opinion is that it's really quite toxic to go into making a game with the idea that one person is going to be giving all the orders and telling everybody what to do. I think that's absolutely the worst way to go about making a game. And I tried, and I always try, but I tried on this project to, as much as possible, have a flat management structure and have it so that people could implement their own features if they felt like it, and people could simply contribute whatever it was that they wanted. my chief concern in the early days was to simply direct the ship in what seemed like a good direction and make sure it had the best possible crew. And the thing is, when you work with incredibly intelligent people, they reward your trust in them. And the most rewarding thing for them is their autonomy. And that means not telling them what to do. So really, my take home for this talk is the less you can be a boss, the less you can be telling everybody what to do, the better the likely results. Auteur, notor, I think it's a false dichotomy, really. I think the best games, you do have an element of personal authorship, but you really need that very early in the project, before the team is really a team at all. Because if you're trying to steer a team around, and they're great people, they're going to resist you, and it's going to have an emotional cost on both sides. So really, I think the best thing is just a couple of drops of yourself in a project, and after that, everybody collaborating. Adrian Smith said it best to me. He said, everybody contributed to the game in their own way, which made it the success that it became. Nobody needs to be singled out. It was a team that made GoldenEye. I'd just like to say thank you for the GoldenEye team with their help with this talk. I've also been asked to remind you to fill out your mobile evaluations. Thank you very much. I'm happy to take questions. Although I talked for 1 hour.
It's also lunchtime at the 4th floor, so questions is fine too. Okay.
A lot of people fight about first-person shooters on consoles versus PC, like mouse, keyboard, and all that stuff. How do you feel that even now, so many years after GoldenEye came out, when people talk about whether or not shooters can work on consoles, they still mention GoldenEye?
Oh, they do. That's cool. How do I feel that people still mention GoldenEye when debating whether first-person shooters can work on console versus PC? I mean, to me, it seems a little bit sad. So some of the acrimony between the two camps, PC is the one true way camp and the console camp, I think they're both, you can make awesome games on either. People will say, well, the little analog stick, it's not so accurate. It's not as accurate as a mouse. But to me, it's like saying in golf, why don't you just pick up the ball and put it in the hole? Every game comes with its own constraints, and playing the game, you live inside those constraints, and they make the game. So it's kind of a strange thing to say to me. PC is designed for spreadsheet software. It's incredible, really, that you can make such an awesome game on it. On the other hand, consoles, they have the price pressure, but at least they're designed, dedicated for games. I never felt any need for a divide between PCs and consoles. I never thought, we can't make a great game because Doom, or anything like that. I was always thinking, let's go for this. I think it's awesome if people still mention GoldenEye. I mean, at the time it was the best-selling FPS, and that's a great privilege and an honor. We put a huge amount of work into making it as great as it could be, and it's lovely to be invited back to talks. It's pretty much 15 years, slightly over 15 years since it came out.
Did you play the, well, let's call it remake that came out recently? And what do you think about the new iteration of GoldenEye?
I played Eurocom Activision's remake a little bit. Honestly, not that much. I thought that it is really close to Call of Duty more in its gameplay and the rhythm of the enemies, the rhythm with which they come to you, the way you approach them. And in many other ways. Although graphically, I could see they put a huge amount of work into trying to be true to GoldenEye 007 on the N64. I think it's actually very difficult to analyze a game. It's actually very difficult to see what's in there. I think it's actually very difficult to replicate that. So, I enjoyed playing it. Maybe they were trying to cater to the marketplace today more, and very difficult. I mean, if that was my job, I don't know that I would say, no, make it just like the original. It's very difficult because there aren't really games in the marketplace today that have that plate spinning thing where you have like 3 guards and you shoot one, that keeps him busy, shoot the next, keeps him busy, shoot the next, keeps him busy, then you go back to the first one again. There's lots of little mechanics like that in GoldenEye to do with the second to second and quarter second to quarter second interactions between you and the guards. Even stuff like the bunny hop they do. It's so silly, but it makes a big difference to the business of actually trying to shoot them. So you're hamstrung today by realism and by the games that are successful in the marketplace. So perhaps that's what they were thinking. I don't know.
It sounded in your talk as if the first time you guys figured out that it was in any way successful was when they called you to ask to give this talk. So what was when did you guys start to feel that, hey, this game kind of matters some way?
Yeah, when did the team realize that, hey, this game kind of matters in a way? I remember going to E3 very near the end and feeling extremely pained at the things some people said when they came up. There were 8 consoles with GoldenEye. People had come up and played them. Some people said, "Oh wow, look at the graphics are amazing," and it's like, yes, score. And then the next person had come and like, what a piece. So, not then. That was 95% of the way through developing the game. We had 5, 6, 7 levels in, working. We were basically nearly done. We shouldn't have gone to E3. We should have been back in Twycross fixing bugs. And the game, it didn't sell like many games do today. It didn't sell a massive spike. So it was really debatable if it was a success once it was launched, and then it came out in Japan and much of Europe. David Oak has a graph of the rentals for GoldenEye in the US. It's very interesting. It's completely flat graph. It just goes on for about 2 years. Just goes on and on and on. The game just sold, not millions. It sold 100,000, 200,000 a month. And then again, and then again, and again. And that was, I guess, when we realized it was something. It was going to sell more than 1 million copies. It was going to sell more than 2 million. Gradually, we realized it was going to have commercial success. But really, I still don't know. And I wonder, are people still going to mention it in another 15 years? Are they still going to mention it in another 50 years? So, games can come and go. They can be talked about for a while. So, really, I still don't know whether it will be eternal.
I think it's time you guys have a party.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah. Well, the GoldenEye team is all spread around now. A couple of guys in Canada and the US, and spread around the UK. But still, yeah, that's a good idea.
Hey, GoldenEye seemed to be this kind of perfect storm of like 8 guys that just never made a game before. Your management seemed to be just, go ahead, do what you like. This kind of really free, happy time of just game development that has become the quintessential Bond game. Every game since has tried to recapture that spirit and that excitement. Do you think that's ever doable again now that the game industry has gotten so serious? Do you think it was a one-time thing of everything coming together and making this great game?
So, GoldenEye was a perfect storm of everything coming together, you say, and it's the quintessential Bond game that people try and live up to. Is there any possibility that could reoccur? First of all, I have no objectivity. I'm completely in love with my games, every one of them, and I don't feel I should be raised up on a podium in a position of authority to decide that. I know that I personally love GoldenEye and the way it turned out, but whether it will always be the best Bond game, I really cannot say. You mentioned one thing I'd like to pick up, which was that I gave the impression that it was all plain sailing, and management was like, yeah, do whatever. I do have some stories of things they wanted to happen that mainly didn't, but occasionally did happen, which I'd be happy to tell if anybody wants to hear them. But 99% of the time, yes, we got to do what we wanted. That seems to be it for questions. Thank you ever so much, everyone.